attaching this trailer vehicle, lowering the boat, backing the trucks back in. You get the idea. So it certainly slows our response time to any type of flat water rescue, which is a fairly common occurrence in Nanaimo. Along with hindering our response time, it certainly presents a challenge in the event of an earthquake. So our current building is not built to earthquake code. Should we experience a large-scale earthquake in Nanaimo, that we would be tasked to respond with either evacuations or emergency management, our equipment and vehicles could be buried in the event of a building collapse. The building is shared, and parking is an issue for not only our members, but our neighbors as well in the surrounding community. 2 weeks ago, we had a task search for a 15-year-old male in Colliery Dam Park, and initially we knew that we needed to call in mutual aid teams. The entire island was tasked, so 14 SAR teams from across Vancouver Island were tasked, and parking presented a huge issue as we were staging out of our current facility. So our command vehicle set up in the parking lot. You have now well over 100 volunteers attending and no room for parking. The property on Nanaimo Lakes Road certainly solves for that problem with some adjustments. So on this slide, we see the property offered. It's located on Nanaimo Lakes Road. We've spent approximately the last 2.5 years working with council and RDN staff, not only to identify this property, but then to undertake a feasibility study, which we commenced last year in 2017. The phase 1 of the project, the feasibility study, included civil work, architectural design and drawings, geotechnical surveys, and then a quantity survey of that combined study to give us a broad cost estimate. Phase 1 cost NSAR a total of $20,000, which was paid from our reserves. The feasibility study identified several infrastructure upgrades that are necessary for us to build on this land. So Advocis was the company that completed the quantity survey with a broad cost estimate. They indicated that paving will be necessary for driveway relocation at a cost of approximately $50,000. Newcastle Engineering, who performed our civil work, indicated sewer upgrades are necessary to the site to even house a facility. That would cost approximately $25,000. BC Hydro indicated electrical servicing is not sufficient to house another building on the land. Electrical upgrades would cost approximately $15,000 to $25,000, and Newcastle Engineering identified a water line that had been inadvertently disconnected a number of years ago, and that reactivation would cost about $5,000. We're looking at a total of approximately $105,000 for infrastructure upgrades required on the land. So pictured here is a preliminary floor plan designed for us by Checkwich Poirent Architects. The architect we contracted for project manager and design for phase 1. You can see it's quite a vast improvement from our current facility. It's a 2-floor structure. The floor design is based on the actual land. So when we did our geotechnical survey, it was found that the footprint of the land wouldn't support a 1-story building. So we had to go to a 2-story design, which of course increased our costs. We offer 6 truck bays here, which gives us 1 spare truck bay as room to purchase a second vehicle, or a third vehicle, pardon me. And then the upstairs here, you see training, office space, and we could actually operate a large-scale full search out of this area. Project estimates are here. Construction cost from the quantity survey performed by Advocis came back at approximately $2 million. Design and development, so paying for the architect, further studies, $100,000. The infrastructure improvements that we're talking about today, $100,000, for a total estimate of $2.2 million. Nanaimo Search and Rescue has secured approximately $1.3 million, $1 million of that from a private donor, and $300,000 from the provincial government. The additional $100,000 is our hopeful contribution from the city to pay for those upgrades. So that leaves us of a shortfall of $800,000, which we are currently working with the RDN to source some additional funding methods to make up that. Some additional considerations for the Finance Committee's thought Our current facility is not intended for long-term occupation by NSAR. It's been indicated to us that the long-term plan for the building involves other uses. We're looking at also increasing construction costs. So advocates in our quantity survey indicated to us that we can expect a 10% increase in construction costs for every year of delay. This project is 3 years in the making, so we're already looking at approximately $200,000 that we've lost just in these studies and surveys and in time. Our current funds that we have allocated for this project also have time constraints. We are looking at the $300,000 allocated by the provincial government must be spent by March of 2019. That's including a 1-year exception that we were given. The majority of those funds were intended to have been spent by March of this year, and we requested an exception from the BC Search and Rescue Association, the association that administers those funds, and were granted that. We have approached the RDN with a request to direct staff to work with us, as I mentioned, to secure the additional funding for the stated shortfall. And that brings us to our request for the Finance Committee is that you recommend city staff work with us to have internal contractors make the required improvements to the city-owned land, or that council supply the funding to have those upgrades completed, and we tender those contracts to individual sources within Nanaimo. I'll take any questions that the committee has. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Strobridge. Much appreciate all the efforts and work that your search and rescue do. And I have one on the board right now, Councillor Kip.
Yeah, Carly, thank you very much, and I so appreciate the work you guys have done over the decades.
Thanks, Councillor.
You mentioned right off the top that I missed the meeting yesterday. I just want to clarify for the bloggers, because they're going to be all over me for missing a meeting, and thanks for mentioning that.
I didn't mean it that way, I'm sorry.
No, but they take it whichever way. In 2006, I wanted Nanaimo SAR to locate to that property.
Yeah, you've been a huge supporter, so thank you for that.
I tried to get the city convinced, and we were there. Public Works was ready. We were getting the telephone lines all straightened out. Then our administrators came forward and says, no, 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 you can't have that. Yeah. It's the reason I quit the emergency program. So the reason I didn't show up 10 years later to a meeting is because I'm really, really tired of the slow and the cumbersome systems we put organizations like yourself through. And when you say your funds of 12,000 or 1,200 hours, you costed them really low, because a technician working in a unionized environment would be making way more.
Yes.
And the skill set that you guys possess. So I just hope we can move this forward and set this up, because more people are getting lost. More people are suffering dementia, and we're getting into more internal searches. So this has been 2 years on the plate, and their $1 million has been hanging there, and it's been just slow. And I'm so sorry that we can't speed this along, so you can just focus. Instead of having to raise money, you can focus on your operations. And I appreciate it very much. And thank you. I just had to clarify that for the bloggers, why I didn't show up.
Thank you. You have been a huge supporter over the years and a very big advocate for us.
No,
so
don't say that.
It's appreciated.
Don't put my fingerprints on you.
Thank you, Councillor Hong, and then Mayor McKay.
Thank you. Thanks for your presentation. You mentioned that this property wasn't going to be intended for long-term occupancy. So the building design that you guys have come up with, is that going to be mobile? Like, are you going to be able to kind of lift it up and move it to a new location, or are you going to have to build a brand new building?
No, the intent for this project is to set us up for decades. We would have a long-term lease on the land that we would negotiate with city staff, and different ownership structures of the building are on the table for discussion with city staff as well. So this intent is to allow us to move into this home and allow us room to grow and stay there for the next 50 years. So not only does this set us up well for our existing operations, but certainly for increasing operations in the future. It also means we're not coming back to council in the next, or the RDN in the next 5 years or 10 years saying, well, now we need this, or now we need another cost. This is a one-time cost for city, and it certainly is going to set us up very well for the future.
Great. And then just to follow up on that with what you commented on, if I may, with regards to, if I'm not mistaken, currently, maybe staff will correct me, you pay rent $30,000 a year? Is that about correct?
Yes, currently we pay rent in that facility. That's actually funded by the RDN.
Yes, and that's where I was getting at. So I think it's about $30,000 a year that they currently pay. So with this new agreement, are you expecting to pay rent again? Or are you gonna be asking for free rent?
Yeah.
Well, I know the RDN pays it, but I'm just trying to come up with, I kind of have an issue with this $105,000 for some of the works, like a driveway. I don't think we really pave driveways for it. I know we kind of do DCC works and stuff. So if we can figure out if this is going to be a reduction of rent to zero, where the RDN then can fund you with this 105 in lieu of rent, because I think we don't charge rent for a lot of organizations, if I'm not correct. So for us to be charging rent for your own building that you're actually building seems kind of ludicrous to me.
Yeah.
So that would save that.
If I might just add, in fairness to the presenter, if we could just keep the
Yeah.
questions direct, and then if any questions, then we can allow the presenter to sit while we debate or discuss.
Sounds good, and I'll
Right,
ask that with staff. I just wanted to verify that it was.
Yeah, I was going just to mention, perhaps city staff could speak to that further. We're certainly open to potentially any lease negotiation that there is. Nothing's off the table for us, of course, at this point.
Wonderful,
So,
thank you.
you're welcome.
Thanks, Councillor Hong. Mayor McKay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. A couple of questions. One is, you referred to the seismic capability of the building that you're in now. Are you relying on our survey, or did you do a survey of the seismic capability?
No, that's current structure and seismic capability, and also our civil engineer of Newcastle Engineering, just for a preliminary, based on the year the building was built, gave us just a preliminary assessment as well.
Okay. Was there any consideration given to upgrading,
Given to what, I'm sorry?
the cost of upgrading
Out of the current building or out of the new facility?
current building?
Yes, of course.
There was a cost.
I'm not sure what your question is referring to, sorry.
Okay, so, we're looking at two different things. One, you have to move out of that building, but you stated that, it has seismic incapability, if you will. So the question I would have is, you didn't do a survey
Correct.
and don't know how much it would cost to improve to a survivable.
Correct, yeah. And we had originally looked at staying in this current facility as an option that was on the table. And this year, during discussions with city staff, it was indicated to us that that wasn't a long-term option for us. So while perhaps there would be potential to use our funds to complete seismic upgrades to this current facility, it still doesn't take the long-term solution out of the equation. So we took it off the table certainly as not a feasible approach. It doesn't make a lot of sense for us to say contribute 200 or 300,000, whatever it might be, to a building that only gives us a 5-year home.
Okay, thank you. The new facility, have you had any preliminary discussions with respect to the cost of the long-term lease?
We've had some very preliminary discussions with city staff, and there, like I mentioned to Councillor Bestwick or Councillor Kipp, that there had been some different options on the table. The preliminary thinking was that our current lease would just continue and be transferred to the new property of $2,000 per month, and the RDN would continue to fund that for us.
Thank you. Can your organization, final question, Mr. Chair, can your organization take on a long-term mortgage?
We've certainly looked at that, and that's one of the options we intend to explore with the regional district. The problem with taking out a mortgage is that our funding is all provided by the provincial government. So we're a nonprofit organization. We don't have any set funding. So right now our operational budget comes from BC Gaming Grant and from funds that the BC government announced 3 years ago that were distributed over the course of 3 years to the tune of about $77,000 per year. That was a one-time grant, and this is the final year of those grant funds. So that takes us to an operating budget that relies solely on gaming funds. Gaming has been turned off by the province before. So if that were to happen, we would have essentially no operating budget. So if we to say to the city, we could take on a mortgage, financing payments would be approximately $25,000-ish per year. if gaming's turned off, we now have no way to service that debt. So yes and no is, I guess, the short answer. It's a possibility, but we need some source of backup funding to ensure we can pay that debt repayment if gaming for some reason was not accessible to our team in the future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I have staff left 3. I don't know if,
It was on for the initial question, but I can leave it till later.
okay, thanks. Councillor Thorpe.
Thank you, Chair.
Oh, you might have been turned off.
Just touch his mic.
Hello.
There you go.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Carly, for your presentation. Really appreciate your efforts, of course. I just wanted to clarify the ask. And am I correct that you're asking the city to guarantee the infrastructure upgrades to the new facility, which would come to $105,000? Is that correct?
Correct.
All right.
And at this point, I don't believe that we have a preference on how that happens. So from our perspective, we were looking at city-owned land, of course, which has been so graciously offered to us. And we are more than happy to tender these projects out and have the work completed ourselves as part of the building. But that $100,000, of course, now eats into the building actual fund. So we're looking either for financing to have these infrastructure upgrades completed, or for city staff to take on the work themselves with internal contractors. I'm not sure exactly how that works, but it was mentioned it was a possibility.
And the best option would be determined through your discussions with staff?
Correct.
Right. That's great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Any other questions? I see none.
No?
Thank you,
Okay.
Mr. Obridge.
Thank you.
Might I, whoops, is somebody? I was just going to suggest that perhaps in the absence of time, knowing that the mayor mentioned that he might have to leave at 11-ish, if we wanted to deal with this as business arising at the end of the meeting, because we do have another presentation from our guests from Vancouver that may wish to get back also. So what's the will of council?
Is there a motion on this specific item that staff is looking for?
No, there will have to be a motion, but that's my suggestion, is that we may refer this to the end of the agenda or business arising, although business arising isn't an item on here. Or we can deal with it
Mr.
right
Chairman, I
away.
may be able to help out with that if I could.
Of course.
Yeah, apologies to council and to search and rescue. We've had a breakdown of communication with a number of the items here. My recommendation is if you could just refer this to staff, that we meet with search and rescue, because we've just had a break between the time the council directed us to work on a lease with the association and them doing their feasibility, what kind of building they wanted. We've had a breakdown in communication between staff and the organization. If you could give us a little bit of time to work with them, we'd come back with that.
Motion to refer to staff and to meet ASAP, I guess, as quick as we can move it along. Thank you.
Moved by Councillor Kidd, seconded by Councillor Hong. Any discussion? Mayor McKay.
Thank you. I'd like staff to drill down further as to exactly what this the desire to look for $800,000 in financing means, and what the future purpose or intention of the current facility is, because I'd like to explore the possibility of selling them that building and that property.
Mr. Chairman, sorry, if I could also, and that's a breakdown of communication there also. There is no other existing dedicated use for that building. Search and rescue can be there as long as they want. Council's also offered that as an option previously. Part of the feasibility for the association was to look at the new site and say, is that the better long-term site for them versus this site? All indications prior to the feasibility was that the new site at the old GNWD board was their long-term. If the club still wants to look at options for the existing facility, that is still absolutely an option. And there's no plans of moving them out. They can stay there as long as they like.
Thank you, Councillor Fuller.
We're on a referral.
Yeah.
It's a referral. Do we want to withdraw a referral if people want more discussion? I'm happy to withdraw the referral if people want to discuss. What?
I think we should test the audio on the referral motion.
Okay, yeah.
So there's a motion on the floor to refer staff to work with the search and rescue as it relates to options for the property and, well, the two existing properties and financing the improvements. I'll call the question. All in favor? I see Mayor McKay, Councillor Hong, Councillor Brennan, Councillor Thorpe in favor. Motion carries. Thank you.
Chair, I'm sorry to interrupt. Could you do who was opposed? Instead, we record who was opposed. So, yeah, I just want to make sure because sometimes by not raising your hand, you actually are in favor. So,
Well,
thank you.
I know, I
So
just
there's-
think, well, point of order, please. I mean, I made a referral prior to the mayor's statement of adding the old building in.
Yeah.
My knowledge of emergency management says that that site is not a good site for this type of operation. It would be a great site.
So it's, to my mind, the motion,
I made my
the
motion
motion
first.
carries.
So it doesn't include that other part.
The motion is approved to refer to staff.
Yeah, but who did not support it?
The motion has been approved to refer the matter back to staff with no more discussion. Thank you.
Just quickly, Ms. Gurry, do you need the no votes for the motion? Because like you say, if you don't raise your hand, you're presumed to have agreed, much like the AAP process.
Yes, the way we conduct our minutes is we need to count those that are opposed. So if you count those that are opposed rather than those that are in favor, that would be helpful.
Thank you. So if my recollection is correct, Councillor Fuller and Councillor Kipp were opposed.
I
Thank
made
you.
a point of order about whether it included the mayor's looking at the old building. Did it include that?
There was no amendment to the referral, so
Thank you.
So does that change your vote?
Yeah, well, it would have.
Okay, so regardless, the
I
vote,
voted opposed, putting me down. as
it is carried. The next item, I'm not certain if staff would like to introduce Ms. Mackay and Ms. Bates-Emer from Kpmg prior to their presentation.
Nancy Ady Mackay and Liette Bates-Emer are here to provide counsel with their summary of audit findings for their audit of our 2017 financial statements, and they're here to present now.
Great. Okay, well, thank you for your time this morning. We provided you the detailed material previously, so we'll just go through the main highlights and happy to answer any questions that you may have. So we're pleased today to be in a position where, pending our discussion with you as the committee as well as the board approval and obtaining a signed representation letter from management, we're in a position to issue a clean audit opinion. We've had the full cooperation with management throughout our audit. There are no outstanding issues, and the finance department was very well prepared and able to answer any questions along the way. When we met with you in December to discuss our audit plan, we conducted our plan mainly in accordance with that. We also increased some of the procedures that we did regarding management override. So we actually increased the sample sizes that we looked at during our audit. We also conducted more inquiries with different levels of management. We also reviewed management expense reports, and we also took a look at some of the detailed workplace policies. Otherwise, everything was conducted as accordance as how we outlaid earlier in the year. The focus, what we spend most of our time looking at it, is what we're required to do under our professional standards related to management override. So we do a number of procedures looking at journal entries, looking at late journal entries, looking at unusual journal entries, looking at making sure that they are properly authorized. We're very satisfied in what we found during our findings there. We had a few recommendations that I'll get into later on that we found as we did our testing. We also spend a considerable amount of time looking at what we call critical accounting estimates. So these are areas that require judgment, and because they require judgment, we spend more time making sure that there's sound basis for the estimates that are used. And included in that is the compensated absences and termination benefits. A lot of those calculations rely on figures that are provided by an actuary. And because the actuary uses data provided by the city, we take a look at the data that's provided, and we also look at the estimates that are used. We also take a look at the collectability of accounts receivable. It had gone up a little bit this year due to some staffing shortages and being very proactive in collecting, but we're very satisfied that the numbers that's in the statement is collectible. We also take a look at the useful lives of tangible capital assets, so that's how long that you're depreciating your capital assets over and making sure that it mirrors the economic useful life. We take a look at contaminated sites, looking at the process and making sure that any potential contaminated sites are well identified. And then we also look at contingencies as well, because that again involves some estimates, but we're very comfortable with the methodology and the numbers and the disclosures that are reflected in the statements. In doing our audit, we came across two corrected audit differences. So these are differences that we noted and we brought them to the attention of management. They were changed, so they're reflected in the financial statements that will be presented to you later. And they're both reclassifications. One is between cash and investments, so that has to do with the term of the investments. That was for 1.1 million. And then also a classification within the statement of operations from other revenue to gain on disposal of tangible capital assets, and that was 1.3 million. So because they're reclassifications, there was no impact on the overall surplus, but they have been corrected in the statements. We also made some suggestions for some of the presentation and the disclosure in the statements, and there were no adjustments that were not corrected in the statements as well, which is also a very healthy sign. So discussed one of our responsibilities as we conduct our audit is if we in doing our procedures, we come across some areas where the controls can be strengthened, then we come back and we provide to you what we saw, what the implication is of what we saw, and then we recommend best practices as well. And we saw 4 that we would highlight as significant, meaning that we would recommend that those are addressed as a priority issue. One was regarding the whistleblower policy, and that was making sure that there's the right channel for escalation, and also that there's an ability to provide the right support for those who raise issues. The expense report review, authorization, and policies. That's making sure that you have the right approval process and the understanding of those who are approving them, what they should be looking for. The consistency of hiring practices. There is a protocol in place and making sure that that's followed. And then the governance understanding and responsibilities. The requirements for governance have expanded greatly over the past decade, I would say, overall, to the point where you have actual courses and consulting companies that work just on providing understanding for organizations as to what corporate governance responsibilities are. So we're recommending, it's similar to previous to this, as Councillor Kipp had recommended, taking a look at the structure of this committee itself, making sure that there's a good process and an overview done of both the committees, the responsibilities of management, the responsibilities of council, and how those all interlay overall. We also had a recommendation regarding reserves. I gather that there's a draft policy in place for looking at reserves, and we would recommend that that be looked at as well. And then we've included some current developments. Usually that's not something that's of particular interest, but we're certainly happy to answer any questions you may have. There are 2 sections that will be effective for this next upcoming fiscal year, but nothing that would create, I think, undue burden on or changes to your financial statements overall. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. Is there any questions for Ms. Mackay? I have Mayor McKay, Councillor Kipp, Councillor Thorpe, Councillor Hong.
Thank you very much. A couple of best practice questions. First off is audit committees. And do you have any recommendations on best practices or can point us in a direction of other communities that have audit committees, what they look like, what their composition is, what their terms of reference are?
Yeah, so usually for an audit committee, it's a subset of, so in this situation would be a subset of council. And usually for the committees, you do a subset so that you allow a deeper dive from a concentrated group of people to kind of help manage the workload that you all have and making sure that the right due diligence is done. I think the terms of reference are pretty good that you have for this committee overall, based on what's on the website. How often, I don't have very much insight other than presenting to you sort of at the planning point and then at the year-end point. Don't have too much insight into what happens during the year. But having as part of any committees that you have, taking a look at those terms of reference on an annual basis, I think is very important. And one of the things that I've discussed with management too, a best practice for an audit committee is that we would meet, not necessarily in such a public forum, but we would meet to go over our audit plan, have an in-camera session, and in that situation, management would actually leave, and it would just be the audit committee and ourselves to give you an opportunity to ask any questions. Usually the questions that we get asked in those types of scenarios are, how is the finance team functioning? Do we have any concerns? Our responsibility as well is to raise any concerns that we have, but as we come across concerns, we do that more ad hoc. We wouldn't wait for an in-camera session. But then, based on the feedback and the robust discussion on the way the audit did and the financial statements, and that would then be brought forward to council or a board with the recommendation from the audit committee. So usually when you have committees, you're kind of pushing that responsibility down to those individual committees. And then the larger group has the confidence that the right robust procedures were done at a smaller group level.
Thank you very much. Supplemental or second question? You mentioned in your report issues with respect to the fact that you had brought forward a number of times over the years and recently our process in Nanaimo for approval of expenses. Can you advise what the normal or what best practices are for approval of expenses through the upper chain of command?
Yeah, so the big thing is to make sure that you have someone at a higher level approving the expense report of someone who's submitting it, and that there are that I'm not approving your expense report and you're not approving mine, because that could provide an opportunity that something could go sideways, which is what we're always concerned about, to make sure that, not saying that anything will happen, but you always want to put the right controls in place, so you just take that opportunity out of the question. When we had looked at expense reports previously, we had found that there wasn't the right supporting documentation. So when you have an expense report, even for an itemized amount, sometimes people would submit, it's a little bit different here because you've got a P card, but submitting a Visa expense is not as good as showing the actually itemized bill that Visa expense is to cover, those types of details. And making sure that you have a very clear expense policy as well, so people are given the right direction and there's no miscommunication or understanding of what is a reasonable expense that the city will cover and what is not.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Thorpe, Councillor Hong, Councillor Kipp.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, ladies, very much for your presentation. For me, the most important page in the presentation we just saw and in your report was the unfortunate deficiencies which you've identified, and I appreciate that. And I think it's very important that we acknowledge those and move to address them. So areas relating to whistleblower policy, expense policies, hiring policies, and so on, governance understanding. So my question is, you've said we need to address those as priority issues. How do we set about doing that? Is that something that you would work in consultation with our finance department to propose some changes, and then those would be brought to council for approval, or what would the process look like?
I think for some of the easier topics, so whistleblower policy, we're happy to provide examples of sort of best practices that we have seen. Mm-hmm. And same, the expense reports policy, I think, is pretty straightforward. And again, we can provide copies of kind of best practices that we have seen. I think on the governance education, that one requires a little more work and involvement. It's not something that we specialize in. We certainly are sort of well adversed, and we see lots of companies and clients where we see it in action and what works well and what doesn't work well. But as I said, there's organizations where you can do courses for there's a whole course, for directors, there are consulting companies that work primarily just in this area of governance. We have provided the finance department with some names of some companies where other clients have used and have been very thankful and appreciative of the work. So I would recommend liaising with some of these other organizations to figure out what would work best for you as a council and the level of detail you're wanting.
Thank you very much. And if I may, Mr. Chair, my opinion is that I certainly don't want to see your recommendations set aside. I want to make sure that they're acted on, and I'm just wondering what the best method for doing that would be. So, Mr. Chair, I don't know if a motion at some point in this discussion is in order, but I can come back to that if there's other speakers. Thank you.
There is other speakers, and certainly any direction to staff would have to come from council to proceed with any of the recommendations. Are you
Done for now, thank you.
Councillor Hong?
Thank you. Thank you for your report. I got a lot of questions and actually a lot of concerns and issues, but let me address the first one first. If I recall, didn't we usually get an in-camera version of this? Someone refresh my memory, I know it's not that great. So usually we get it without staff, if I'm not mistaken, because there were some issues that the auditor wanted us to bring up without slamming staff. And this report slams council, the chair of this committee for no apparent reason, and upper management and staff, which is not fair. Publicly, it's all in the press. This is not fair to this council, or this committee, and senior management. Because page 75, the whistleblower policy, if I'm not mistaken, that's an in-camera item. Do we ever rise and report on that? Because I don't know who can answer that question for me, because I don't ever remember talking about that in public.
Well,
Well, you can ask the presenter.
Yeah.
So I think over the years, there's been various processes followed here. Sometimes there has been absolutely no, I've attended meetings and haven't presented anything. Like the material's been presented, but there's been no actual presentation. Sometimes I have presented. Sometimes we've had meetings off to the side, which is my preference, is that we have the side meetings with management present to go through. And normally the process would be that management would go through the financial statements, and then we would talk about our audit. So what we found in doing our audit of those financial statements, answer questions, and then management would leave, and then that would give you an opportunity to ask us any questions along the way. Our recommendations that we find throughout the audit, those we present, and however that you deal with that information is not, whether it's public or private, we're reporting back to you as the Audit and Finance Committee. I can't speak to how you want to arrange that going forward, but that's certainly sort of our responsibility, is making sure we're providing that information to you. And as we go through, as I said, we identify what we see and then what the implications are of what we see, and then recommending to you what the best controls would be to make sure that you're not exposing inadvertently the city to any risk going forward. And that's a process that.
Great, and thank you, and I appreciate it, and I do agree with the recommendations. Don't get me wrong, it has nothing to do with the recommendations. It's just the way that this came to the public. Because I won't be supporting this until we get a legal opinion from our FOI head and our HR about some of these items that could be in camera that were not discussed. And it with that, so.
Mr. Chair, this seems to me to be a discussion of our internal procedures with the auditor rather than us talking about it. I don't think the auditor really can comment on whether or not Councillor Hong wants to approve the report or not. I don't think that's a matter for them to have a discussion with us on. I think we need to clarify what they say, and then we make our own decision amongst ourselves. I don't think they need.
If you're calling a point of order, I would just say that the information that is being discussed is contained within the report that we've received. And to your point that furtherance of that conversation may best not continue in its existing form, but if you have specific questions.
Yep, I have
as
more
it relates,
questions. Great.
Would be more appropriate.
And Chair, I would just like to actually comment because it's basically our processes and staff are being called to question here on how this was put out, and I wasn't quite expecting it, but I did check into it because this item is kind of inflammatory and did make it to the media. But these letters have always been published. They just haven't always said what they have said, and it didn't come across my desk to proceed in camera or not because these letters and reports are always made public. So I would just like the record to reflect that this wasn't improper or done out of process, and staff didn't incorrectly publish this on the agenda.
Yeah, and I agree, it wasn't staff's point. I usually remember us getting this stuff in camera first. So I'll continue with my questions. With regards to your Appendix A, number 2, expense report and review on authorization of policies, can you please give me an example of what the RDN or another municipality does with regards to an appropriate internal control? What do they usually do? So do they actually come to America? I think that's a great idea. I think the CAO should be doing a finance and audit meeting. We should get all of her expense reports and approved by their boss, which is this board. So, and I agree with that. So is that what other municipalities do? Like, what does the RDN do currently, or any other city that you do this audit for?
So usually it would go to, if there's an audit committee, then it would go to the audit committee chair or to the mayor. Those are usually the two different avenues.
Great, and thank you. So we haven't changed this policy, so why do you bring it up now? Like, I know that you do it because you found an issue, but if this is best practice, I think it's good for us to be the city to pursue all best practices in every department, not only finance, but everything else. So that comes to the next question is, we had this issue with P-card spending with the NEDC. We had Kpmg do a report. So why wasn't this addressed last year or the year before, so HR, finance, and other staff members could have mediated this and said, hey, you know, we had this issue. You guys should seriously look at this. Because now you're telling us, now we're going to tell staff, like, well, we need to fix this. But we could have had this fixed, and we wouldn't be in this situation that we are in today. So my question is why are these things coming up now when this council, this staff, haven't changed anything? It's always been this practice. So why now?
Well, I think we've raised issues related to the NEDC before, that we didn't feel that there was the right rigor provided to reviewing those expense, reviewing those expense reports. That's no longer an issue. And then this year, when we took a look at, as we said before, with respect to taking a look at some of the policies in a little more rigor this year, we came across that actually what we had presumed what was happening previously with some of the more senior levels of approval process in place was not actually happening. So that's why we were bringing it forward.
Okay, thank you.
I'm
done.
Are you finished?
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Kip.
Well, thank you very much for appearing before us, and like you say, I've sat here for decades, watched various machinations of our reporting, of how we do reports, and even your report changes year to year and are hard for me to follow. When I check back to 2011, the reports, and I'm deeply into this. In 2014, UBCM pushed forward Public Services Accounting Board 3250 and 3255. And I look into your reports around 2014 about the uncovered liabilities. So for me, it's a problem. And from an accounting perspective, to not have a liability in a clearly transparent methodology in our public service. And I find that the contingency is concerning to me. And I'm very concerned with the front page of the paper relating to the governance issues regarding this plan. So, are you aware of the 2014 UBCM strategies to put the 3250 and 3255 into the line items?
I'm not familiar with the exact references that you're making, for sure, but is there a concern about the information that's in the actual financial statements? Is that
Yes.
what you're, so-
Well, for me, yes, because I don't see our liabilities. I understand over a $7 million liability, maybe more depending on it, and that is for sick benefits, termination and those.
Sure.
And a lot of times they're under commitment and contingencies. They've been always labeled as commitment and contingencies, which doesn't mean a lot to people.
so I think, sorry.
Go ahead.
I think, in just looking at the statements, I believe perhaps, look, you're talking about note 6 to the statements where it talks about the compensated.
Yes.
Okay, so the liability is in the balance sheet. So it reflected in the actual financial statements. Now, there may be a question on how you fund that and whether or not you fund that through a reserve or how.
A surplus.
Or how it's managed.
Not a reserve.
But the actual, well, and we just have to be careful because the terminology is a little bit different.
I know,
But
people
the
confuse the terminology
right,
sometimes.
but the actual liability is reflected on the statement of financial position in the actual numbers. There's a note explaining it. But how you account for that and how you want to fund that is a little bit of a different question. And that there's a wide range of policies or practices that are followed across different municipalities, very similar to when the tangible capital asset section came in, and there was depreciation, and there was a lot of confusion of, well, it's a non-cash item, how do we fund that? Do we budget for it? Do we put aside a reserve? How do we deal with that? And I would say that these types of future benefits associated are very similar in that you'll see a wide range of practices. You will see some municipalities wanting to set aside a reserve, and that reserve could be 50% of the amount, it could be 100% of the amount. You will see some fund it through surpluses.
Honestly, I have to say, all I want is the best practice. I don't care if 40 other municipalities are doing it some way. What I'm looking for is best practice, and what I can, as an elected official making 30 grand a year, 40 grand a year at this, can prove to my citizens they're seeing all of the budget. So I appreciate that. I have further questions on that. Joint and several liabilities, site restoration, RCMP contingency, and employment future benefits are all in the same realm for me. And I want to see those put into the budget. So is it best practice to not show those, how they come out of year to year? Because currently what we do, prior to council seeing the surplus, it is my understanding that prior to us building a surplus this year of 2.7 million, money goes into each individual line item where those contingencies rest. So if Public Works has so many people, that's my understanding, it's been a very quick explanation of it. But we don't see that surplus as a council, and the public doesn't see that line item. So they don't know that contingency exists, which is right now, I believe, 7% of our budget is sitting out there where it's undetermined where it comes from year to year. And I am of the solid belief that it cannot be attached to a surplus considered a revenue. And I don't believe that's a revenue source. If so, and I want to ask you, did you ever look over our Deloitte report or our core review?
I looked over, yeah, we've definitely reviewed the core review.
So in the Deloitte report, it talks about it too, where we take in 2016, $50 million in capital spending, and 24 million goes out the door in actual productivity and work. So 24 million is moved into those reserves and surplus. And then some of that surplus comes out every year, regularly, into the underfunded, or the, I'll say, non-transparent. So is that a best practice? I would suggest not.
Well,
And so-
I think there's different types of things. When you're looking at anything we're needing an actuarial report where you're projecting out into the future, you're dealing with a lot of uncertainty, and you'll see inflation rates, sometimes if it's tied to investment returns, it fluctuates greatly. So I would suggest that probably best practice is not to have a reserve at 100% of that amount, because otherwise you're going to get the fluctuation. So you want to get something that's probably going to give you the coverage that you want, to give you that comfort level, but not have the wide fluctuations up and down, because I think that's a bit distortive.
But see, I think that's what the public misinterprets in this is when we tax a little extra to build reserves, which I love to have money for the future. And I don't have a lot of future left, so I can spend it now. Right? You know, I mean, I'm not here for a long time. But so for me, my perspective is I want to get past this one now. So you kind of answered my question on the joint and several, the site restoration, and they need to be clear. Where I have a concern that it isn't clearly represented is, for example, the Port Theatre. We have a promise of $4 million to them. So staff has been, for a couple of years now, building that contingency. Because we might, if they got their filming, if somebody walks up today and gives $4 million, then we have to have our side ready. And so we'd have to pay for that 4 million, so the covering cost is $380,000 a year. So if our covering cost for a liability is put in our budget year to year and it's showing where we're taking the taxation for it, shouldn't that be all liabilities? And that's just a statement from me, you don't have to answer that. Whistleblower policy. One of the problems I've had here is there is no whistleblower policy, and there has not been one. And when I try and dig information out, people are afraid to talk to a counselor. And they've been told, and I have witness for it, by talking to Councillor Kipper Bestwick, you may be interfering with the corporation, and it's grounds for dismissal. That came back to me. So whistleblower policy has been on my books for a long time. And I've talked about back in 2011, even on your report, I've talked about unfunded liability. So this is not new to me. So the whistleblower policy has been, I've been asked about it. I have emails to 3 or 4 of the previous administrations asking them for that, even this current one that's not here right now. So I appreciate the fact that you brought forward whistleblower policy. What is positively not correct for me is, like the Deloitte report says, with governance of the management. When you say governance education, it's not just including council's governance and operation. It's the staff's governance of this plan. So what I'm saying now is, I have noticed for a long time our budget and fiscal management policy is not in place. Brought this up before, our reserve policies, our revenue policies, our debt management policies, and some administrative procedures and guidelines have been waiting for it. And I have a motion right now sitting on the board. I don't know what happened. I had to leave the meeting the other day because I'm tired of being face looks and things at me. I just have to leave eventually. So these policies were supposed to be in place. We had a contractor in place to do this. When all of this stuff, all of this bad management practice that we're doing, all of this whistleblower policy come out, we had a person working on this, and now they're delayed for 2 years. They come out of the core review from 2016, all of these policies. So when I hear one of my peers say, act on recommendations, and Councillor Hong said it too, how as an auditor can you not demand these recommendations? Do you continue to work with a company that won't implement your recommendations? And do you just continue to give us a year-to-year balance stating, and do you not build a list of all the outstanding recommendations you've built and they go forward every year? Because I see policies that haven't been implemented since 2016, haven't been implemented on the Deloitte, and haven't been implemented on the core review. And so it's very concerning to me. And when I look at our year end and the statement here,
Another point of order.
page 19, this is the auditor statement.
I get it.
The Council of the City of Nanaimo has delegated responsibility for the integrity of the financial information.
I'm assuming that there's a question coming forward.
There's a lot of editorializing after questions and then moving on without even waiting.
Okay, I'll improve my speech, I'm sorry.
I will ask Councillor Kip to
Speeches.
I will ask Councillor Kip to refine his
This is why this
question.
should be in public. This is why this should be in public. Yeah, the public isn't here. On page 19 of our today's report, the city management report, December 3rd, the first paragraph states that the City Council of Nanaimo has delegated the responsibility for the integrity and objectivity of the financial information contained in financials to the management of City of Nanaimo. So by me not implementing policies and by not putting a motion forward to implement these policies immediately, I'm at fault, and I appreciate that. So, but here, we delegate the authority of this budget and all of its content to our staff and to you, our auditors. That comes through in your statements, and it comes through across on. Is that true, that we delegate the authority?
Sorry, I
The statement,
didn't
page
follow part of
19,
that.
It's from.
I don't have the page reference, so I'm not
Oh,
quite
okay.
sure what you were
Never
referencing.
mind then, I'm done.
Thank you.
I'm done.
Councillor Fuller.
Just terrible.
So I'm on the city's website looking for some of the so-called policies, and I'm finding very few of them actually here. So having easier access to finding them for council and the public would be beneficial. Workplace or whistleblower, definitely not on there. So how we would find out about that and what that is, I don't know. I appreciate, excuse me, I appreciate you coming forward with all of these. This is how we find out what the deficiencies are, through mistakes being made in council and through reports like Deloitte, the core review, and KPMG's auditor's report. So I do appreciate this. As you have stated, many of these are already in the works. So hopefully as people have alluded to, the Facebook community will be saying that, but they tend not to. They tend to just focus on the deficiencies you mentioned, not the management's response. So most of these are under works. The hiring policy is an interesting one, and definitely I think we need to review that, because I'm also wondering if in this policy there is a termination of contract policy. Councillor Kipp alluded to someone looking at certain policies and no longer looking at them. So that is one I would like to see added to this if it is not already there, because when we terminate someone, we want to make sure we do it in the right process and the right means, and with all of the aspects of it taken care of. So as Councillor Kipp said, we had someone working on a number of these issues and trying to bring them to our attention, but that person is no longer with us. So I think we actually need to add a termination policy.
And I think going back to my earlier comment about the structure of committees, oftentimes you will see a governance committee. So that's a committee that looks after policies and reviews things. You will often see an HR committee. So again, that would be another topic that they would perhaps take a look at. So when you kind of take a look at your overall structure and then figuring out where do you spend a lot of time, audit and finance, is there a governance one, is there an HR committee? I think that's part of the wholesale review that I would recommend that you take a look at.
See, now that's a great suggestion. I appreciate that, and it is definitely something we could look at. You did mention something about committee structure. The basic committees are being educated at this point. Ms. Gurry is coming in and talking about terms of reference, et cetera, roles and responsibilities. So that one is already happening. Our P-card thing is happening. We really appreciated the forensic investigation Kpmg did on that, which highlighted a number of deficiencies that we are currently working on. So, as I say, I really appreciate you guys and the information you put in these reports. Perhaps sometimes we don't read them as thoroughly as we should. And we find out about deficiencies through people like you, through the public, and through mistakes. So, thank you.
Councillor Brennan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just wondering, you've suggested that we review the policy on reserves. What in particular made you come to that conclusion?
I think having some questions over the years regarding some of these items and not feeling that should we have a reserve for that, should we not have a reserve for that, it made me feel that there was not, and the fact that there had been a policy underdraft that had not kind of come through fruition and had been an actually approved policy made me think that there was some confusion, or maybe everyone hadn't landed on what you really wanted to be doing with the reserves and which ones you wanted to be building up, which ones not. So it would provide the finance some direction, as well as it's not best policies to be finishing off the fiscal year and then going back and putting money into reserves. If you set a policy and then during the year you add to those reserves as you go along, then you're not making these swings at year end, because really what is reflected in the year-end statements should be the activity that happened within the year. And if it requires council approval, then that approval should have been received in that actual fiscal year, not post December 31st.
Thank you. That's not what we did. Then you have the consistency in hiring practices. Again, I just want to go back to that. It says it appears that in some situations, steps in the process are bypassed. What can you describe that more fully, please?
So when we looked at, there are some procedures that are followed depending on the level of hiring.
Yes.
So the question is either, if it's not consistently followed, that would lead us to believe that either the policy needs to be updated and there's been the determination that not all those steps need to be followed, or if you have a policy, then it should be followed. Okay. It's kind of, it's one of the, right now as it reads, you have a policy, this is what should happen. So therefore, that's what should be followed.
Right.
Now, it could be that that needs to be updated.
Sure.
But today, that's the policy.
And was this consistent through hiring of union staff and hiring of excluded staff? Was there consistently instances where the process was bypassed?
We didn't look at the, we were only looking at manager and above, so I can't comment on other levels, and it was just a sampling. Obviously, we didn't, that wasn't the focus of our review, but as I said, as we go through our audit and we come across areas where policies are not being followed, then we raise them, explain why we think that's something to consider further, and then offer our best practices. So we're always taking a look of the going forward, not so much in the looking backwards.
So I'm just going to push this a little bit. Can you give me an example, or are you allowed to give me an example where there was blanks? I'm looking like maybe I'm moving here into personnel issues, but yes, okay. Okay, then I will leave that. I know that the library board does have a whistleblowers policy that we have worked on. So perhaps we can look at those things, because I think they're important. I think one of the examples you give in this report is, it's alarming to me. So I think that that's something we need to work on immediately. So thank you very much for this report. It's very illuminating.
Thank you. I think we've had all the first-time speakers. Councillor Hong.
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to bring up Councillor Brennan's points with regards to reserves. So I just need to understand a bit better. It says best practice with that all approvals of changes to reserve accounts be obtained within that fiscal year. So are you saying that movement from one reserve, because I know that for the fire hall, for example, we were gonna start the design and our finance officer says, well, we'll just take it from this reserve, do the project. When we get the loan, we'll put the money back into this reserve. Is that what kind of you're referring to about moving money in and out of reserves, or am I missing the boat?
Sorry, it's the timing of it. So when you have your statements that end at December 31st, those statements are to reflect all the activity that happened up to December 31st, where right now, oftentimes you will have movements between reserves that are approved and agreed upon, but they're not actually approved until after December. So if they're approved in March, then they really should be reflective in the next fiscal year financial statements, because it hasn't happened in the actual year that the statements are reflecting.
Okay, so staff are just being prudent to make sure that there's money in other reserves to kind of put it forward in the following year.
Well, I think that's right. If you have a reserve policy, then you'll know, okay, overall, we want to build up this one to reflect a percentage of a liability or whatever it is. So then that can be adjusted throughout the year. And then whatever it is at the end of the year is what it is at the end of the year, and it can be adjusted going forward in the next year.
Okay, I think prime example is our snow removal reserve. I think we said that we would at least like to have $500,000 into it, and I know we used it all previous years, and this year we put 170 into it, and then we would top it up. So when we top it up to 500,000, is that what you're saying? We should have a policy with regards to everything else that we're not going to add any more to it?
Or if you're moving funds into that reserve that requires approval, that those funds be moved into prior to December 31st, if you want it shown in that December 31st financial statement.
Great, thank you. But then how would that work with surpluses?
So you should, hopefully you're not being surprised with the surplus after year end. You have a pretty, it's not going to be an exact science, but you'll have a good idea of what that surplus is. So then you'll allocate it based on your best idea of what the surplus is prior to December 31st.
Which we didn't do. So we had, I don't think we had a surplus number until April, Committee of the Finance and Audit?
It was in the following year that we understood what the surplus amount was, to my recollection. I could be wrong.
So are you saying that we should get our surpluses before December?
An idea, and again, it depends on what ones you are approving on.
Yeah. Okay, great, thank you.
Mayor McKay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And then Councillor Fuller.
Okay. Thank you, Councillor Chair. Councillor, pardon me, or Chair. Can you advise me, and I might need help from both senior staff and yourself, because it's been brought up to me recently. What are best practices with respect to borrowing from yourself? It was suggested that rather than take a 1% GIC, put your money into 1% GICs, and then go to MFA for borrowing and paying 3.5 or 4%, that you would borrow from yourself. And if I recall, that was done a number of years ago on some short-term capital requirements for the water treatment plant. I could stand to be corrected, but this was from someone who seems to know the ins and outs of municipal financing, and he kept saying to me, "Why aren't you borrowing from yourself, from your reserves, to fund some of your projects?"
So the reserves aren't cash, right? You have your cash and your investments on your balance sheet, and those are what you can use to actually spend funds on. So your choice of whether or not you're using MFA debt or bank borrowing debt or reducing your investments are really how you're projecting rates to go and your investment returns to go. That's sort of a financing question that way. Borrowing from yourself is maybe in relation to moving around different reserves. That would be my best estimate as to where that comment's coming from. Don't know.
That's all. Councillor Kipp, Councillor Thorpe, did staff want to respond to that?
We actually are doing internal borrowing in the 5-year plan that you just did first 3 readings of for sewer projects. We are borrowing from another reserve fund to fund some projects, and we'll be doing a payback, and we pay interest in accordance with the rules. And we have done internal borrowing, I believe, for the conference center. So it has been done in the past, and when it's appropriate and we have funds available, we do look at that as an option.
Thank you. I think I may have, you're all good? I think I may have messed up the order. So if there's no objection, Councillor Fuller, you actually were next, but no. So I'll hit your button there and then.
My mic off. Put my mic off. Just press it.
There you go.
Thank you. It's interesting, the hiring and the policy, which we actually don't have another one that I cannot find in our list of policies. And you can find hiring information, which states it is the policy of the city of Nanaimo, but I don't believe it's a written policy. It does talk about QP, IAFF more predominantly, actually pretty much more than excluded management, etc. There's a number of terms and conditions, collective agreements, et cetera, which are great. Now, with the excluded positions, in the past, what they've done, and it's interesting because in the hiring information, it says, in order to build a diverse workforce, all qualified candidates are encouraged to apply. So it says all are encouraged to apply. But we often hire up. And I'm
Councillor
wondering.
Fuller, could I just intercept? Could we ask questions of the presenter?
That's what I was doing.
More specific to the report, if we can get to there more expeditiously, please.
Well, that was one of their recommendations in the report with the hiring policy. And, I'm just curious if Kpmg would think that it would be more appropriate that all positions go out for applications, and certainly the people that are currently wanting to move up in the organization would apply, or just move people up randomly, as they have in the past. That's happened more predominantly, in my opinion, with city manager
Chair.
positions.
Chair, I would just like to interject that that is actually the current policy, and a lot of these policies that are referred to aren't on the website. They're departmental policies, HR policies, finance policies. They are public, but they're not publicly posted, so we can send them to you and what it is. But when there is a posting for a management position, it does go to all. It goes inside, outside. So just wanted to make that clear.
Thanks, Ms. Gurry. I'm just going back to a number of instances where city managers have gone directly up from below. I appreciate knowing that these policies are public, and perhaps if links could be put to them on the city website, that would be great, because I'm sure the public would like to access more of that information rather than having to do it through an FOI process.
So if I might
Yeah.
just, again.
Thanks.
Thank you. So if I might just again say, once we're finished with the questions to the presenters, we will have the opportunity to make whichever motion or motions as it relates to the findings of the report. And so I'll just try to move this on a little bit. So Councillor Kipp, then Councillor Thorpe.
To put my mic on,
Sorry.
Thank you. I have now questions related to this. There's some serious allegations or some serious concerns of management overrides were brought forward. Did you talk to the CFO and the CAO about it? Did you have contact with them about these serious override concerns?
During our interim procedures, when everyone was in place, that's where we saw some of the protocols being followed or not being followed. But obviously with them not currently in place, we'd only dealt with management that is fulfilling those roles now.
So you didn't talk to the CFO and CAO about this allegation of management overrides? You didn't go to them and talk why they were signing off on each other?
No, I know that that was what was happening, that from discussions from them, but didn't have the opportunity to discuss that further given the timing.
Oh, okay. And did you confirm why the mayor wasn't overviewing? Because you state in your statement under significant control deficiencies that, in I think it's number 2, where the mayor should oversee the CAO on day-to-day work. So did you pursue why that wasn't happening?
I think, again, sort of coming back to that governance structure, I don't think that it was well established as to who would be the right person to take responsibility for that.
So that's something we have to do. I appreciate that. Thank you. And I noticed on the HR thing, I've noticed now more and more that HR should be embedded with finance. Do you find that as a practice in other places, especially with those long-term liabilities, RCMP, site remediations and those, the more embedding of HR in the actual process of building the budget? Because they know those, HR knows those contingencies, those liabilities better than the finance people do, I would suggest. So do you see that in your line of work, more and more HR significantly embedded into the production of the budget, the planning of the surpluses and the revenues?
Well, I think from a governance perspective in different committees, still see an HR committee separate from a finance committee, but certainly in building the budget, information flowing from all different committees would be what would need to happen.
Only 2 things fail in relationships: is communication, and communications not in any order. Right, that's what fails. So thank you very much. And one more follow-up on that. The responsibility of the council compared to the CEO are not well understood, along with fiduciary duties. I think that's across the board in everything. I really appreciate that statement in your significant controls. I appreciate it. With the HR stuff and the disciplinary stuff, you raised it in your file that letters were put into a file, and you confirmed that they were specifically raised because they were put in because of the complaints, because you mentioned this HR thing, which is a concern to me, that's openly mentioned. Did you confirm that that was the reason? Or did you just know that there was letters? How deep did you go into that file is what I'm asking. Or were you only informed by staff?
No, I was informed by others as well that there had been disciplinary letters put into the files of those who had brought forth complaints.
So people are talking to you about HR issues?
People within the city with the knowledge of the situation alerted me to that.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your work. Thank you. It's tough work, especially in municipalities right now with these budgets, 200 million. It's intense.
Thank you. Councillor Thorpe. Sorry, I'm trying to, there we go.
Thank you, Chair. This is all very interesting information. I appreciate it. I don't have any questions for the auditors, but I've been attempting to craft a motion when questions are finished. So I don't know if there's other questions.
I think there's nobody else on the board.
All right. Then if I'm,
Good, yeah, that would be a good idea. Motion to receive the presentation.
second.
So moved by Councillor Brennan, seconded by Councillor Thorpe. All in favor? Opposed? Carried. Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Councillor Thorpe.
Thank you, Chair. So as usual, Ms. Gurry, her staff can help me, but I would like to propose the following motion relating to this topic, that city staff be directed to work with the Kpmg auditors to implement recommendations identified as significant control deficiencies in Appendix A and B of the report, striving to implement best practice for future, and to then have staff bring forward the resulting report to council.
Thank you. Do I have a seconder for discussion? Seconded by Councillor Brennan. And then, would you like to have any comment on your motion?
Thank you, Chair. First, I'd just ask Ms. Gurry if she's got that and if she thinks it's worded appropriately.
Yeah, I think that that's fairly worded, and I have most of it, and we'll catch the rest later. As long as everybody has a clear understanding of it, I'll just make sure I have the wording correctly so that we can read it at the end once it's voted on.
Thank you.
All right. Thank
As I understand, in the appendixes, there's 4, and then the 5th would be the reserve policy that Ms. Mackay alluded to. But are you making specific reference to the 4 deficiencies?
The ones I'm referring to that I have under Appendix A are whistleblower policy, expense report review authorization and policies, consistency of hiring practices, governance understanding and responsibilities, and then under Appendix B, it was to do with reserves.
So you're incorporating all 5?
Yes.
Okay.
So I don't think I need to speak further to that if the intent is clear. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Hong.
Thank you. I don't have a problem with the motion per se, but are you
Asking staff to work specifically with KPMG, or can they work with somebody else? Because that's the question I have. Like, I don't mind them, whoever, I think KPMG recommended, there were some others that could do this, but they didn't specifically say that they need to do this. If it works out to be KPMG, so it is, but I don't want to limit staff to say that they have to work with KPMG, and KPMG said that they have recommendations that they could give to staff to work.
So if I may, the intent was not to limit staff to work just with KPMG, but since it's KPMG making these recommendations, they have to staff. And if they are recommending other sources to consult with, I certainly have no objection to that.
Okay, good. I just want to make sure that that's clear with the motion. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Fuller.
Similar to what Councillor Hong says, I'm glad Councillor Thorpe clarified. I was curious as to whether KPMG actually developed policies such as hiring, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm glad to hear it's a bit broader. Will we need to allocate a budget to this, which would end up having to come out of the 2018? And will we have to allocate a budget to do this? Because we're talking about working with KPMG. They don't do it for free. And I'm sure anybody else that they recommend would not be doing it for free. I do think it's a great idea that we do review these specific policies and others that might come up.
My only comment to that would be that we do have council contingency when we have directed staff on the 5 subject matters to entertain improvements. With that, I would suspect that there would be an understanding of what that cost might be, and if staff were concerned about the amount, that it was beyond significant or something, that they would come back to us before proceeding with all 5, or 4 of the 5, or 3 of the 5, or so on and so forth. So I trust that staff would come back to us and say, your intentions were great, the cost is going to be X, do you still wish for us to proceed? And if that's a misunderstanding, I would like staff to please say so.
No, that would be how we would approach it. A couple of these can handle in-house with staff. So we've already drafted, we're in the process of finishing up a reserve policy. So, I mean, having KPMG review it to make sure that that's best practice. But most of the work on a couple of these items would come in-house. But if there was a significant ask for a contractor, we would come back and get council's approval for that.
Thank you. I might just also add, I think it's number 2, the expense policy, P cards, approvals, who does that, who doesn't do all of those things. On January 21st, council made 8 recommendations as it relates to P cards. And so, and I believe that policy is also being redrafted or rewritten or as we speak. Is that everybody else's understanding? So I think we're well on our way to the, some of the 4 or 5 items being addressed, if they haven't been addressed already, just not formalized. And I stand corrected if that's a misunderstanding. So I'm not misunderstanding?
They're being worked on, yes.
Thank you. Mayor McKay.
Thank you. I'm speaking in favor of the motion. And I'm speaking in favor of the motion because it clearly states KPMG. And the reason for that is because this is work that is a result of a recommendation made by our auditor, who council selected. We appoint the auditor. Now the auditor's made recommendations. A member of the committee has put a motion forward that the auditor would work with staff, and that's why I support it. It makes more sense to have the people who did the original audit to help with the recommendations, their recommendations. So I support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll call the question.
Does it go to council, or we make that motion here to task them?
It will go to council, is my understanding,
Yes, yes, so you,
Recommendation to council.
yeah.
from this committee.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll call the question. All in favor? Opposed? Carried. Thank you very much. Everybody wants to soldier on? Nobody wants to take a quick little 2-minute break or anything? Nobody wants to take a break? Okay, great. We'll just move forward then. Mr. Harding, I think you've got the next several,
Oh, sorry, Chair.
correct? No, am I not correct? Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Thank you. I just want to, I have concerns again with this KPMG report of that page. Can we get a legal opinion on it, please? Do I need to make a motion with regards to that?
I'll second it.
Because page 75 on the whistleblower policy, I don't recall, and not to blame, like, I'm not blaming staff, but I don't recall ever rising reporting on this issue. So I'd like to make a motion to get, especially if this is going to be an FOI issue, I don't want it to be problematic that we've disclosed, knowing the public saying that we disclosed in-camera information knowingly.
If I might just, you referenced page 75.
Yes.
And that's,
So-
75 is Appendix A.
Yep.
Are you, if you could just clarify what your specific, is it an opinion?
Where it says during the year, senior employees raised concerns regarding the appropriate use of city funds and the ability to collect funds owed to the city. And the initial concern appeared to be handed efficiently, but the problem that I have issue is in response, disciplinary letters were placed on the complainant's employee files.
And Chair, through you to Councillor Hong, I have a question about the rise in reporting of this. I don't understand that part of like what,
Well,
I
I
don't
thought this
understand
was
what
an
I'm
HR
getting.
issue, and why we're discussing HR issues in an open document, because it's HR. So unless council rise and report on an HR issue, it's kept confidential. It's HR.
Yes, and Chair, through you to Councillor Hong, the issue would be if the personnel matters relating to the employees affected, they could have a complaint about their privacy being breached. But yes, this, like I said, this is always a public letter. It didn't come across my desk, whether it should be in camera or not.
I agree.
Because it's always just an open document. It doesn't state any names, so if these employees did want to say their privacy had been breached, I don't know what the outcome of that would be. So I could look into this, but I'm just not really.
And that's why I would like a legal opinion, not to you, but for as a legal opinion to
And
look
what would the
into it.
legal opinion be for? Like, the legal opinion would be like whether this should be published or not?
Yeah. Or struck from the record. Or an
So
error.
if we can just keep it to one, I know, but I have to try to keep a little bit of.
And I think maybe we should hear from Mr. Van Horn.
So, have you made a motion?
Yeah.
I second it.
And could you please, if I could just ask the clerk to read what the motion says? I'm sure it's going to be asked later in any event.
That staff obtain a legal opinion on the release of the HR personnel matters that were published on page 75 of the agenda.
Okay, is that your?
Yeah.
Okay, and that's what, thank you. Thank you. Any further discussion, staff? I have.
And well, I just think that we should hear from Mr. Van Horn before you vote, please.
Take a microphone if you could.
I just think there've been a number of questions that have been asked here that in order to provide the answer, the appropriate forum is going to be in an in-camera meeting.
Yeah.
Because there's questions about, hiring people at randomly under a hiring policy or something. And I want to dispel rumors, concerns that might be there. And speaking about letters on files, terminations, things like that, there's an appropriate place. A bundle of information to speak to it at the meeting on Monday night, but we ran out of in-camera time there. But I think you've clearly got questions. There's a good place to answer. I think what's in the management letter there probably goes about as far as we could prudently go in saying anything in public here. But I think if you've got questions, instead of speculating, instead of wondering, let's go in camera at some point and let's get those questions answered.
So it seems as though that anything, if this motion passes, it would be an in-camera response.
With the legal opinion.
Yes.
Because it's illegal on HR matters.
Yeah, and I guess I'd just be seeking legal advice on it, a little more specifically about what you'd be looking, because there, for one paragraph to have a lawyer comment on, is it okay to say this or not? Well, that ship has kind of sailed. It's out there. If it's having further discussion on personnel matters, I think that's standard in-camera business. But I could always seek that a little more guidance on that. But just to be a little clear on what it is council would be looking for, or the Finance and Audit Committee would be looking for on that in seeking a legal opinion.
Well, the reason I want legal opinion is I want to make sure that this report isn't a risk to the city. That's all we do, our fiduciary duty is to ensure that we minimize the risk. And when we talk about FOI information or a personnel issue, it could be a risk. I just want to make sure that this isn't a risk.
And I respect what you're saying, Councillor Hung, and I think that Mr. Van Horn alluded to that at the very beginning of his conversation as it relates, that we should probably be having this conversation as it relates to page 75 in camera. And so if you make this motion, or you've made the motion, and it'll be up to council to determine whether or not they'd like to proceed with the legal opinion on the subject of page 75 of this report.
Yeah, I think For me, as it is right now, it's anonymized enough. I actually have more concern when we go in camera and start talking about stuff. I know there's been a lot of concern even expressed amongst council on a number of matters that it goes in camera and then it immediately comes out. So I think my trepidation is going to be, once the discussion is full and robust in there, keeping the genie in the bottle, so to speak, because that we seem to be challenged with that. And in providing more information, I'm trying to give council the best information available to understand and to have a little more confidence in the decisions that are being made here. But there's that risk that what happens to that information afterwards. And so I think getting you the information you need is beneficial. Our oversight here, but I think it's yeah, the in-camera meeting would be the place where, in providing more information, keeping that information in confidence seems to be something with which, you know, we've continued to struggle. So.
And Chair, I just want to add further to Councillor Hong from a privacy breach perspective. Like Mr. Van Horn was saying, this is anonymized enough that there's no way to direct it back to an individual. Therefore, it wouldn't be a breach. So for that point of liability, if I was to go to the Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner and say, has this been a breach? Have we breached somebody's personal privacy? I can almost guarantee you that they would come back and say no, though that is something that I could do as well. But like Mr. Van Horn said, the more information we get into, the more risk we do have of actually having a breach, because those personnel matters and employees would then be named, etc.
Oh, boy. You guys didn't want to have a break. So I have Councillor Hong, are you done?
Yep, and again, this wasn't about any other issues that Mr. Van Horn brought up. This was just about this statement.
So we have a motion on the floor. We have Councillor Kipp, Councillor Fuller, staff. Is that somebody different than you, Sheila? Thank you. Or Ms. Gurry, sorry. Councillor Thorpe. So if there's anything that's going to alter how you're going to vote on this subject matter, then you might want to speak about it now, and if not, because, okay, 1, 2, 3, we have 5 speakers, so I'll just go through the speakers list. Here we go. And Councillor Hung, you're done. Thank you. Councillor Kipp, Councillor Fuller, Councillor Thorpe, Councillor Brennan.
This is not just a single issue for me. This is FOIPP, on and on again. Like the staff person just alluded to, the genie gets out of the bottle the second we walk out of that room, if there's in camera. So why do this in camera? What is the big, this is already out. I want an opinion if this is breaching, and it's not just this one. This page 75, it's in the newspaper. People have talked about it. Staff is quoted about the stuff going on. So where is this privacy stuff? Where does it go? I mean, it's a tough one for me. Stuff is in the newspaper. We got out an hour out of our meeting the other day, and stuff was in the media about you voted this way, who did this, why did you do that? So it's either bugged, I've had it checked once, or something's up in the leaks. So I'm looking how all this stuff goes out. Certain amounts go out, certain don't. I'm offended by some of it. I'm happy for some of it, and that's what happens here. So for me, this motion is important to start finding if this is really the process. We've had a lot of struggles with freedom of information and the lack of confidentiality. Been going on for years here with this group. Never seen it before. So I support this motion.
Councillor Kipp brings up a point that I'm astounded with. Are you saying that you had that room over there checked for bugs?
I did.
You did?
I had a little device and I walked through to see if it was bugged.
Was council aware that you were doing that?
No, this is for my own protection because I've been labeled in the media by certain people and had letters written about me by certain people.
This is astounding.
Yeah, no, astounding. I know my references and I know what I'm looking for. So, yeah, I got a device to check for things that are being listened to, for cameras, for all of that. That's my life. You guys have attacked me enough around here with your crap. So
If we
I
could-
protect myself. And you're astounded that I'm protecting myself after the letter you wrote about me? Are you astounded?
If we could, I'm going to make an attempt to, if we could move on to Councillor Fuller.
Astounding.
Yeah, I'm going to support the motion, but I do agree with Mr. Van Horn. We do have other matters we need to discuss. Sadly, whatever we discuss in camera is going out there, whether there's a bug in the room or not, it's going out. We've established that. There is nothing we can do to prevent it. You can censure people as much as you want, but if they ignore the censure, so be it. So I do want to go further with this, and I'm hoping we can do that in camera with some of the other hiring questions, et cetera, et cetera. So I will support the motion.
Thank you. If we can just stay on point on the motion, and the motion is to seek legal opinion on page 75 of the Kpmg report as it relates, and then you can massage that however you wish. So unless there's going to be something that's going to alter how you are going to vote right now, I have two speakers left, Councillor Thorpe and Councillor Brennan, and then we will be calling the question unless you would like to do that immediately. And I'm asking Councillor Thorpe and Councillor Brennan, I'm not shutting you off. Councillor Thorpe?
Yeah, I'd appreciate, if I could, Chair, because I'm not sure I can support the motion, and maybe Councillor Hong can clarify for me. I'm not sure that I see its necessity. I totally agree that any issues that are HR issues should be discussed in camera, absolutely. What I'm hearing from Ms. Gurry is that to this point, what's on page 75 does not constitute a breach of privacy. And I'm satisfied with that if that's her opinion. If there's breaches from in camera, I don't condone that, but that has nothing to do with getting a legal opinion. And I'm just not sure why we need to get a legal opinion. And again, maybe Councillor Hong can help me out on that. Thank you.
Thank you. I have Councillor Brennan.
Thank you. I agree with Councillor Thorpe. The clerk gave us a plain reading of the legislation, and in her view, it doesn't breach it. She says that she can almost guarantee that a lawyer would come back to us and say it's not breached because of this section that she cited. So I think that we would just be throwing money away, and we've already had a look at what we've spent on lawyers' fees. And for us to go seek a lawyer's opinion for something that is a clear and plain reading of the legislation tells you it's not a breach, I can't support spending money on that.
Do you, Councillor Hong?
Thank you. To answer Councillor Thorpe's and I guess Councillor Brennan's question, the reason that I'm saying this is kind of an example that Councillor Brennan mentioned. She wanted an example on number 3, the consistencies of a hiring practice. She asked for an example, didn't get an example. It was a policy that we should relook at, and I get that. Same with number 2, there's no example. The issue I don't have an issue with the whistleblower policy. I don't have an issue with any of these recommendations. I think they're great. But when Kpmg comes out and puts this statement in there compared to the other ones, when they don't have a statement, that is the issue I have, is when they give a specific example. I want to know, well, kind of come to my first question, why didn't we get this in camera? Had we had this in camera, I would have asked Kpmg to strike this note before it went out to the public. And that's what I'm trying to get at, is because I know that it's not, I'm not blaming staff for their information, it's this report. So if we can get a legal opinion that says, yeah, you know what, Kpmg they shouldn't have done this on all these other ones, then we can now have a legal opinion when this comes, hopefully before that we can vet this to make sure that it doesn't violate anything, and that's all I want. Is there are no examples in any of the others. Number 2 doesn't have an example. Number three, Councilor Brennan asked for, well, an example of a situation that the process was bypassed. There's no example. You know, none of these have examples specific to these recommendations. And the problem I have is this phrase, this one paragraph. Everything else I'm fine with. It's that one paragraph that gives a specific example, which should be struck. And that's why I say I will not accept this policy. It's not fair to these other ones when they don't give us examples. If you're going to be consistent, so be it. Be consistent.
Could I just interject here for a second, just to answer a couple of those? I was actually the one in the audience that was, telepathically screaming at Councillor Brennan, don't ask that question, because it cannot be answered in an open meeting. So it's not that there is no answer, it's that there's no acceptable answer in this form. And I think, to put all that detail in the letter would probably make it quite lengthy, and it would obviously make it an in-camera thing. I think the purpose of that was to generalize it enough, knowing that there would be some follow-up questions to it in the appropriate form. But that wasn't that there wasn't an answer, and I'm probably,
and I agree.
As an appropriate person to answer that question, but there was no answer because it was me calling off the question.
And I agree, and I know that this statement should have been, there's an answer. If this whistleblower policy was 2 paragraphs, and Councillor Brennan says, well, can you give me an example? That was the example. We have examples for all these, and that's why the recommendations are there. But the fact of the matter is, none of those examples were in the other points. And I'm not arguing that there aren't examples. I'm not arguing with not to do these recommendations. Having that example on that one, which we're not denying, none of us would deny it, that there needs to be things that need to be addressed. It's the fact that there was a specific paragraph in number 1.
Thank you. I think your
That's
point
it.
is well taken, and we do have a motion on the floor. I'll call the question. Everybody's comfortable with the motion that's been read out? All in favor? Do I need to call the question again? So all in favor? Opposed? So this requires a chair to vote, so I'll be voting in favor of the motion. Motion carries. Next on is the 6B is the travel assistance grant. Mr. Harding. Oh, it's not?
We have to have the financial statements approved. First, there's a report for the 2017 financial statements.
Is that?
It's, no, it's A. Sorry. Yeah, 6A.
My apologies, I'm sorry.
No worries.
6A, and Ms. Mercer, if you could please introduce the finance recommendation as it relates.
Okay. So under section 167, subsection 4 of the community charter, it states that by May 15th of each year, we have to submit audited financial statements to the inspector of municipalities. So in accordance with that section, we're here to present the 2017 annual audited financial statements and request that the committee recommend that council approve them. As stated in the Kpmg presentation, they've completed their work, their audit work, and are prepared to issue us a clean audit opinion, and that says that the statements fairly represent the financial position of the city at December 31st, 2017. And in order to comply with the community charter, we need council to approve the statements. There's a few highlights in the report. I'll briefly go over them. We have $17.9 million in unallocated surplus. So these funds can be used for any unexpected future liability, and it's split between general water and sewer. We have in reserves $141.9 million, and that's split between general reserves, statutory reserves, and development cost charges. We have $42.3 million in debt. That works out to $446 in debt per capita for Nanaimo. And in 2017, we borrowed $1.5 million to fund equipment purchases related to the automated garbage project. And We have a net book value of tangible capital assets of $686.2 million on our books. And that's comprised of anywhere from land, buildings, equipment, infrastructure such as sewer, water, and transportation, drainage. And yes, so those are kind of some of the higher aspects of the financial statements. And that's all I have to say.
Okay, thank you. I have three on the list right now with questions. Councillor Hong, Councillor Kipp, Councillor Yocum. Sorry, Mayor McKay, sorry. Mayor McKay.
Thank you. Through you to staff, just a question with what you said about $17.9 million of unallocated surpluses. So is that a reserve or is that a surplus?
Through the chair to you. It's not a reserve, it's surplus that we have not, it's unallocated, it's surplus that we haven't allocated to a reserve. And it accumulates for each one of the funds that we have, water, sewer, and general. And it's split almost evenly among the three. And that is used, like I said, to fund unexpected liabilities that may come up that we just didn't know about. So the Colliery Dam funding, that was one of the items that they had used unallocated surplus in the past.
Okay, thank you. And then we just had an earlier comment with regards to borrowing from a sewer money for a sewer project from a different thing. Well, if we had surplus, wouldn't have you used that for that project instead of borrowing it from a different reserve?
It's not really meant for that. Like, you can borrow from reserves because we have various ones, and if there aren't any plans to use some of those reserves in the immediate future, then that's the place that you would borrow internally from.
Great, thank you. And then under the next page on 15, where we have that reserve account, what does surplus proportions mean with 34.7 million? Is that 17.9 in that 34.7, or is that totally separate?
It's totally separate.
Okay, so what does surplus proportions mean?
It just means that those reserves have been, over the years, money has been accumulated through surplus or budget allocations into those reserves, and they are not in an immediate use. So the work in progress is, those are funds that we've identified in the next year that will be used.
Yeah.
The other money is there to be used. I mean, some of it may have
Carried over.
future uses, but carryovers, like carry forwards, would all be included in the work in progress number. So that money is there for future use.
So that reserve is kind of an unallocated reserve for no specific projects that we have planned. It's just kind of a savings account.
There's many in the financial statements on
For the future years, but I'm talking about next year.
Yes. So
Yeah.
if you look at, there is a note 22, which is 47 of your agenda. It lists all of the different reserves, and they have, each one of them has somewhat of a specific use.
Yeah.
And it identifies the current, what the current portion of that is and what's available for future commitments.
Yep, that's what I figured. Okay, great, thank you.
Councillor Kipp.
Oh, thank you. When I refer to page 14, that's where I see the general fund, sewer fund, and a water fund. And I'd love to see those unfunded liabilities in a column there and show that in the, that's where I think would be the transparency of those, the promises, the other promises of liability, where I could see it nicely reported right there. That would make me happy. I don't know if it does anybody else. The tangible asset was 640 million? 648 million, or something like that.
686.
686, I didn't get a chance to write that. What is our actual value of stuff in the ground? I would suggest it's at $3 billion for a 60-year replacement.
There is on page.
So what I'm saying is, like, if I want to replace half of our infrastructure and it's worth $3 billion, then I'd need $1.5 billion in 30 years. And so 500, every 10 years, I'd need that 500 million as outside replacement. And that's what I really support reserves going for, that long-term benefit. So our tangible assets are based on current value.
The tangible assets are based at historical value, so what we paid for them. And then it's and how we've depreciated them over the years.
And then to replace them, we calculated the current standard, whatever cost book you use for a current replacement standard.
Yes, and keep in mind that what's included in the financial statements as tangible capital assets will differ slightly from the 20-year asset management plan, because in these, there is a threshold on certain
Assets. They
assets.
lose
So
their
we wouldn't track every single,
light pole.
or chair or those kind of things, right? Exactly. And so that's where they start to differ a little bit in value, but these are at historical costs, whereas the 20-year plan looks at what will it cost us to replace them.
Yeah, that's the asset management. And I guess that's my point on this, is looking to see what, like our water system was worth so much to build, but it's worth way more now. Water is worth more, it has more value, more chance for revenue. So it has the ability to charge more. And of course, I hate to tax everybody. Another thing I like on page 16, when I go per capita debt, it sounds good. We're only in debt $446 per person and $471 in 2016. That means they're going down in debt. But that's based on per capita, and that's based on our population of 96,000. And there's only 35,000 taxpayers. So it's really, for the taxpayer, it's 4 times that amount, or 3 times that amount. Because the taxes pay debt.
If you allocated it over taxable properties,
Yes.
the number would be different,
A
yes.
lot, yeah, but per individual, but for me, as my house, I pay for all my kids and everything, right? I pay all. Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate the work.
Thank you. I only have one question. So upon approval is to council, so this is a recommendation to council, but we have another step in between this, correct? So that we,
Yes, so the minutes from this meeting would go to the council meeting, special council meeting on Monday for approval, and then that gives us our approval for the ministry, yeah.
but do we not need to do something previous to that so that we avoid an additional fee? Or
That's the next meeting.
it is? Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay. So the recommendation is that the Finance and Audit Committee recommend that council approve the 2017 annual financial statements for the city of Nanaimo. Call the question. All in favor? Opposed? Carried.
Council was approved.
Mayor McKay, is there anything that you would like to shift around in the balance of this agenda, given the fact that you are having to maybe leave or not?
No, Mr. Chair, I just want to get this one dealt with.
Okay, thank you. So we're at 6B, Mr. Harding, Travel Assistant Grant, Cedar Community Secondary Senior A Basketball.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have 4 grants in front of you. We haven't had any intakes to the council yet, so there's 4 there. If the council has any concerns, I also brought the full policy if you want to look at any of them. Staff recommend all 4 grants that we're presenting in front of you. But if you want me to go through each one, I could.
That's a very good point, Mr. Harding. So there's B, C, D, and E. Does anybody have any objection? So if I might, moved by Councillor Hong, seconded by Councillor Kip, that the committee approve travel assistant grants B, C, D, and E on the agenda. And if anybody would like to pull one of them out or do seriatim or otherwise, then now is your opportunity. Otherwise, we'll call the question. Councillor Thorpe, did you wish to speak?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'll certainly support all 4, but just for clarification, I'd like to point out that under C, where it indicates Vancouver Island University Mariners Volleyball Club, it should be made clear that that is not the VIU team. It is a separate club team which is affiliated with VIU, but it's a U17 or U18 youth team, so it's not the university club or university team. Just wanted to make that clear. Thanks.
Thank you. I asked Mr. Harding that same question prior to this morning, given that we could find ourselves with multiple requests from VIU because they're so successful. And we might not have enough money in the budget to send them to all of their tournaments, but in any event, call the question. All in favor? Opposed? Carried. And item F is the Maffeo Sutton Park Inclusive Playground Grant Funding Application Update. Mr. Harding.
Yes, thank you. If you remember, council give us direction to work with a number of organizations on the inclusive playground. This is just to advise you of a grant that we're applying for through Jumpstart, and we just want to make sure that, because if we are successful, then those funds would go towards the playground.
Thank you. Moved by Councillor Hong, second by Councillor Kipp, and Councillor Kipp.
Does, regardless of the funding, this goes forward, or do we only work it if it's the funding?
We're doing phase one regardless this year, but of course, as you know, with playgrounds, and particularly inclusive playgrounds, the more we can get, the more we can do.
Yeah.
So we're continuing to work towards increasing that funding.
Perfect, thank you.
Call the question. All in favor? Opposed? Carried. Thank you. And then item G, Mr. Sims, is to advise council of a budget transfer requirement to proceed with the construction of the Westdale Sanitary Sewer Upgrade Project on page 110, 111. Thank you. Do I have a mover?
Move the motion.
Moved by Councillor Kipp, seconded by Councillor Hong. Any discussion? Call the question. All in favor? Opposed? Carried.
Can I ask a further question? Mr. Sims, what type of up pricing are we seeing right now, percentage-wise? Is there any, like, do you have an idea of, like, because I notice even everybody bidding things right now are finding some people aren't even bidding because they're so busy or getting one bid for things. And I know the housing market is extremely busy. Everybody's working like crazy, which is good. Do we?
Yeah, it's an interesting dilemma to be in. It's good to have a strong economy, but in these times when we are letting projects, we're seeing 10 to 20% over what we expect them to see if we budgeted last year. So we're trying to sort of catch up to that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I don't think that there's any other items. Motion to adjourn. Moved by Councillor Kipp, second by Councillor Hong. All in favor?
We
Carried.
voted on that, right?
Yeah, we voted on that.
Yoakum, so you had to have all of council to waive it, I think, don't you?
Yeah,
Not just those present, eh?
No, it's the procedure
For
by,
adjourn.
yeah, the procedure bylaw says it's all members of council. So it's not just all members present, it's all of the members of council. So the way it's worded, it means all of you.
So we have to come back for 1
Yeah.
o'clock. Oh, good. I'll wait.
Sorry for fucking yelling at fucking Bruce, but.
Which one? Oh, I don't care. That's bothering me.
Oh, but it makes you look like you're not chairing or something.
Oh, to me.